Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we're going to do a screencast on the beginnings of the Great Depression, particularly its impact on human beings at that time. So we're going to really understand why this was so depressing and how miserable it was. So why don't we get started without further ado? So our agenda is going to be kind of like focusing on the suffering of the Great Depression, then our mighty President Herbert Hoover and his response, and then of course he's going to fail a little bit, and then this new guy is going to come along and promise something different, FDR. And then FDR is going to promise to fix things, and it's going to be called the New Deal, all of his ideas. So we're going to kind of handle those four concepts in a row. So let's get at it. In the 1920s, of course, were known as a great time, economically speaking, for many, many people in the United States, certainly people of privilege. And there's going to be a lot of commerce. Business is going to be thriving, economically speaking. The United States is more powerful than ever. People are happy. They're dancing. They're violating prohibition. There's culture and music. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Babe Ruth. Sports are thriving. It's just generally, culturally, economically a good time. And then 1929 comes, which is not necessarily a good moment for U.S. history. Things are going to get depressing, downright sad, and that's going to be the beginning of the Great Depression. So let's do a deep dive into what that means. Number one, on October 29th, 1929, it's going to be famously known as Black Tuesday. And that's going to be the day when the stock market doesn't go down or go down a lot. It crashes. It just, boom, hits rock bottom. 16 million shares of stock were sold. And when you have that many shares sold, basically that means the value of the stocks go down and down and down immeasurably. So the stock market crashes, and by 1932, the stock market had lost 90% of its value. Now, when you are a person, wealthy or otherwise, and you've lost 90% of your savings, because a lot of people in the 20s put all of their money into the stock market, very much not a good thing. It will mess up your weekend and the next weekend of that. People lost that money. So number two, another impact on people was banks began to close. Now, people put their money that they didn't put in the stock market, they put into banks because banks save money, right? The reason you'd be motivated to do that because the bank will give you a wee little bit of interest in order to take your money. But the problem is banks can go out of business. And when they did, they shut down and millions of Americans went to get their money back and it was all gone. So the banks lost all of their money, they went out of business, they closed, and people lost all of their savings. That was very sad. Imagine losing your every penny you had saved for your entire life. So we're in a tough spot. People lost their money in the stock market to the tune of 90%. They lost their savings in the banks. Three, GDP, gross domestic product, is basically a measure of how wealthy the economy is. It's a statistic where you add up all the, essentially the spending that the American people do on their products or services or whatever. So when you look at the GDP of our country, it was $103 billion in 1929. That's how much money we were spending. Of course, that's when you spend money, you're economically healthy. In 1933, it was less than half. And that means we lost 50% plus of our wealth. And that is huge. Now, when people don't have any money to spend and GDP is down, that means millions of U.S. businesses are going to go out of business because nobody can buy their stuff. It's kind of like a cyclical problem, right? People lose money, so then they stop spending money, and then other people lose money, and so on and so on. No, the number fourth human impact was unemployment. People lost their jobs, not because they weren't hardworking or because they were incompetent, just because economically speaking, businesses couldn't afford to pay them anymore because nobody had money. So 1929 to 1933 million workers were out of business. And this was at a time where there was no unemployment. The government did not help you out. This was an age of laissez-faire where the government should mind its business and you solve your own problems. So here's just an image of a bread line. People that used to wake up to go to work now are going in this massively long line just to grab enough food to feed their kids. And just not even great food, just bread. These are soup lines. I mean, just look at all those people lined up, how depressing and sad that is. So in 1930, in New York City alone, 6,000 people were so unbelievably desperate that they just stood all day in the middle of the streets selling apples. I mean, that it didn't matter how much schooling or education or how hard they were, how hard working, that became their life. 12 hours a day trying to sell apples so they could feed their family, get some type of money. Very sad, sad, sad. Number five, impact on people. Foreclosures. When you buy a house, you usually don't have enough money, so you need to take out a loan from a bank, and that's called a mortgage. You have to pay the bank back. But if you can't pay the bank back because you lost all your money in the stock market or The bank went out of business. Now the other bank forecloses on your loan, and they take the collateral that you had to put up, which basically means they take your house. You've lost your home, and millions of Americans lost their homes, and they just grabbed tents and scrap metal, and they just built little like campsites in the middle of nowhere, wherever they could find land, and these were called shanty towns. People in America do tend to blame their presidents for everything that goes wrong. So a lot of people called these shanty towns, where people went from real homes to these, now into Hoovervilles, because they were blamed Hoover for everything that went wrong. I guess he was partially to blame. So anyway, shanty towns were very depressing. So also, if you were on the streets and you had no home, not even a shanty home, you'd often wrap newspapers around you to keep you warm, and those were called Hoover blankets. And when people's pockets are turned inside out, that's often a symbol of not having money. People call those Hoover flags because they, the cotton hung like a flag would. So Hoover was very much hated at this time for not doing enough to help people. Number 6, negative impact on human beings was just shame. One could argue that when you are a father or mother and you usually have a job and you take care of your kids and your family and your spouse, and now you can't, that destroys you. You can't even feed your own children. And mental health was not a phrase that was too popular back then, but mental health issues were huge because people were like, I can't take care of my children. This is going to result in a massive increase of suicide during the Great Depression, which is certainly a negative impact on people. Number 7, parents did indeed lose everything, right? So 250,000 teenagers were told, we can't feed you. You need to leave. You need to go try to make it on your own. And they did. They left home and they did what they knew to do. They got on trains and they rode the entire country, stopped at every town, looked for work, didn't find it, got back on the trains. And they lived a life on the railroads, and they're going to be called hobos, these very young teenagers without families, without a home, just traveling around the country. Now, of course, the reason they went on the railroads was because they waited for their trains to start, and then they sprinted and climbed up, and they got a free ride. And that would be an example of a hobo-filled train during the Great Depression. All these people just nowhere to go, but just trying to get away from the hopelessness of where they were, including their families that could no longer take care of them. Look how young they are. Number 8, human impact, farmers. Now, farmlands, farmers owned tons of land and they couldn't pay the mortgages, so their land was getting foreclosed upon. Over 364,000 farmers at the beginning of the Depression lost their land, and that's going to be super important later when we talk about more about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Number 9, from 1929 to 1932, there was an income deflation. Now, we often hear about inflation, that's basically prices going up, salaries going up, the devaluing of our money. Well, anyway, the opposite of inflation is deflation. And why is that an issue? Well, if there are millions and millions of people that don't have work, businesses can start paying everybody that does have a job significantly less. They'll just say, well, if you don't want to make less, then you're fired. I'll just hire one of those desperate people out there. So even if you had a job in the Great Depression, and 75% of the people did, you weren't getting paid hardly anything because everybody knew, every business leader knew they could just fire you and hire somebody desperate for less. So crazy. Number 10, negative impact on human beings at the beginning of the Great Depression. African Americans specifically had it so much worse than white Americans. The famous phrase, the last hired, first fired. So if businesses had to fire people because of the Great Depression, they fired African Americans. And African Americans wouldn't be hired back even if businesses did well because they were the last. Businesses had to be desperate to hire them. African Americans suffered over 50% unemployment to white Americans pretty much probably 20%, right? A national average of 25%, peaking in 1932, 33. So here's a famous quote from actually printed in a newspaper: no jobs for African Americans until every white man has a job. I mean, that was actually posted, printed. So what is the suffering Americans had at the beginning of the Great Depression? Money loss from the stock market, savings loss with bank closings, businesses shutting down because nobody had money, so people lost their jobs. Unemployment, had to sit in bread and soup lines. People lost their homes with foreclosures and had to join shanty towns. Suicide rate went up because people were so unbelievably depressed they couldn't take care of their families. Children were kicked out to go fend for themselves and traveled around the country without homes or purpose. Farmers lost their homes at higher rates than other Americans. Even if you had a job, you got paid less. That's called income deflation. And of course, African Americans had it so much more harder than white Americans. Now, Let's not forget that at this time there was no unemployment compensation. In 2023 or whenever, if I lose my job, the government takes care of me for a while, so I can feed my kids, feed myself. That did not happen back then. Americans were just on their own. If they didn't have anybody to help them, they might just starve to death. So in 1929, Americans were desperate, and then we needed a leader to save us and support us. And now let's talk about that leader. Herbert Hoover was president at the time of the Great Depression struck, 1928. He wins this election overwhelmingly, wins most of the country. And his famous quote, "In America today, we are nearer a final triumph over poverty than in any other land." It was in 1928, we thought we were the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and we were. But a mere couple months later, 1929, the stock market crashes, the economy crashes, and Herbert Hoover is asked to help. But Herbert Hoover does not help. He does not believe that the government should give direct relief to people that are suffering. He believes in laissez-faire, that basically the government should stay out of the economy and not regulate businesses and not help people. He believed in rugged individualism, that Americans needed to pull themselves up from their bootstraps, basically a famous expression saying, you need to solve your own problems, otherwise you might get lazy or weak. We got to be tough in this country. It destroys people's character when you give them free things, because then they know they don't have to work hard for them. And we don't want to destroy people's character. We want to make them work hard and be hard. So in 1929, the American people get angry. They're like, Hoover, help us. We need help. Well, so number one, Herbert Hoover basically says, I can't help you. I don't have enough money. I only have money from taxes. You people aren't working because you're out of work. I don't have any money. How am I supposed to pay for programs to help you? And at that time, it was considered responsible not to go into debt, to carry a balanced budget. You only spend money that you have, and how can Hoover help people if he doesn't have any money? It made sense at the time, but that was his excuse for not helping people. Number two, Herbert Hoover, a lot of people resented his optimism. He said, I am convinced that we have passed the worst. He believed that the American people just needed positive attitudes and stop complaining. So he tried to be as positive as possible. I would argue that there's a lesson here from Herbert Hoover, that when people are suffering, they don't want smiles or optimism. They want somebody to empathize and to help them. Well, on March 3rd, 1920, Hoover also said, all the evidence indicates that the worst effects of the crash on unemployment will have passed during the next 60 days. We're almost out of this. Things are going to improve. And of course, they did not improve, certainly for not 2 or 3 more years, and people resented that optimism. It's almost like he was lying to the American people. Number 3, Herbert Hoover also did something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Now, this is super important. This is going to be key to his presidency. What Hoover basically said was that Americans were losing jobs. And what we needed to do was to make sure Americans bought American products and not foreign products. If Americans buy American products, that will keep American businesses in business, and that will keep jobs. So Hoover put the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act on, which basically put massive amount of taxes on foreign-made goods. And that means the foreign-made goods are going to be more expensive, and then Americans are going to buy American goods and keep American companies in business. It actually made a lot of sense. I totally support it. But the problem with that situation is other countries were so mad that Americans were no longer buying their products because we put tariffs on their products, that now they put tariffs on us. And now our products were super expensive, and nobody in other lands or countries bought our stuff, and that put our businesses out of business, and they were put out of business. Tariffs crushed us. If you look at this chart, you can see how much trading there is in the world, and then it went down, in large part because of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, maybe the worst law ever passed. Thank you, Herbert Hoover. Number 4, the economy just kept going down. The market kept going down, and people blamed Hoover, and they were angry because of his laissez-faire attitude. He wasn't willing to do anything. He prioritized balancing the budget versus going in debt and spending money to help the American people. All of that optimism pissed people off because there was no reason to be optimistic, and they felt left behind. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act stopped world trade and put us into an even greater depression. And things never improved, no matter how optimistic Hoover was. So in 1932, we have another election, of course, every 4 years for the president. And people are going to say Hoover is the most hated man ever. And Hoover's not going to have any chance. It didn't matter if you ran Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse would have beaten him. But lucky for the Democrats, they didn't have Mickey Mouse. And they nominated this dude, the governor of New York at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the winner of that election is going to be President Roosevelt, FDR himself. He dominated the election, and 472 to 59. And that's going to give the American people hope, because he said, I will not follow laissez-faire. I will do something. I will support you. I will help you. So let's briefly talk about FDR in 1932. Even though FDR won, FDR, the United States did have a problem. Hoover, even though he had lost the elections are in November, and at that time, new presidents didn't get sworn in until March. So what we call that is a president that is in office but already defeated and therefore unwilling to make any decisions. They're just waiting out the end of their presidency. It's called a lame duck, and Hoover was a lame duck. He's like, I can't pass any more laws. The American people hate me. I'm just going to sit here and do crossword puzzles. So he was a lame duck, and that meant he wasn't willing to help. And during that time, Americans were suffering. So that said, the election to inauguration was, 4 months, way too long. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, once he became president, immediately changed the Constitution with the passing of the 20th Amendment. That said, from now on, inauguration will not be on March 4th, 1933. It will be on January 20th. So whoever gets elected in November will quickly be able to take over and will quickly be able to help the American people. So that's the 20th Amendment. Now, in his last day in office, Hoover said, we have done all that we can do. There's nothing more to be done. And boy, would he be wrong. There's a reason we consider him one of the worst presidents ever. FDR would come along and save the day. And some people think FDR is the greatest president for everything that he did. Now, just a little background on FDR. Number one, he was from New York. He was governor. Number two, people generally consider him either number 1, 2, or 3 best presidents of all times because of how he helped us in the Great Depression. Number three, how long was FDR president? He actually got elected to 4 terms. He died at the beginning of the last one for a grand total of 13 years. Nobody else has ever gone past 8. It's pretty crazy. In fact, the Republicans were so mad that FDR was president for so long, they were going to pass the 22nd Amendment that said from now on, no president can get elected more than twice, maximum of 8 years, and to some extent 10. Well, anyway, number 4 detail on FDR, he was in a wheelchair. He did not have the loose use of his legs. He got sick in the 1920s. His legs became mostly paralyzed. And in the 1920s, again, that was the name of the disease. I had trouble pronouncing it. It wasn't polio, it was this. But he always tried to hide it. FDR knew that at that time people were prejudiced in the United States against disabilities, that he would be perceived as weak if he couldn't walk. So he hid it. He always had braces on his legs, and he made people wait to take pictures of him. And he was always braced by the person next to him, if you notice. And there he is, holding on to somebody. And reporters were very respectful and only took pictures of him sitting down. Like here's the big 3 at, I think, the Potsdam or Yalta conference. So that said, FDR always was filmed sitting down, and nobody really knew about it. And so on number 5, detail about FDR, as compared with previous presidents, presidents previously didn't have connections with the American people. They were just kind of locked in the White House, and people really didn't know. There was no great transportation back then, so people didn't see the president ever. So what did FDR do? He says, it's a big country. I want to know my people. So he started doing fireside chats. He used the new technology of radio. Every Sunday night, he spoke for at least an hour, telling the American people what he was trying to do to help them. And so entire families would sit around the radio listening intently to what their new president was going to do to help them. And people became intimate with President Roosevelt. This had never happened before. They all saw him as like a grandfather, pulling them together and trying to save their lives. So FDR, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, people loved the man. And that's going to help. With that type of support, he's going to pass more laws than just about anyone. So kind of a lesson out of this situation was not everybody agreed with FDR, but they did know because of his fireside chats that he was trying. He would do anything to help. And that won people over. And he's going to dominate. Now, this is going to be a lesson, the idea that you should always have a connection with the people you represent. So FDR did it by radio with his fireside chats to connect with the American people. John F. Kennedy is famously going to be the first president to have live press conferences with reporters to have a connection. Obama is going to famously have a weekly YouTube address. And then, of course, Donald Trump is going to maximize this type of communication with the use of Twitter. So whenever you can connect with people, that's how you gain their support at the highest levels. It's a good lesson about popularity in politics. Now, reason number 2 why FDR was beloved by the American people, and that would be his wife, the greatest first lady of all time, maybe, Eleanor Roosevelt. Because FDR was in a wheelchair, he couldn't get out of the White House. He was hiding it. He was stuck there. So what he did was he sent Eleanor Roosevelt constantly traveling around the country, looking for people that needed help, learning their stories, and then at dinner, she would tell him who she met. And this would fuel his bill writing, and he'd be like, we need to help those people. And hundreds of bills later, FDR is going to help so many people, all because Eleanor told him exactly who needed help. And there she is traveling around with all the people, and so on and so on. So I mean, she met tons of people, but Eleanor Roosevelt famously was supporting women's rights and African American rights. One of the most famous stories is that the first African American pilots were basically going to have their program shut down because there had been a couple of discipline incidents and some deaths, which was not too uncommon in the military. And so Eleanor Roosevelt directly rode down to Tuskegee and went down there and said, you know, I want to fly up in your planes. The white officer immediately said, I'll take you up. She said, no, I'm going to fly with the African American officers. And it showed that Eleanor Roosevelt, if the first lady was not scared to fly with these pilots, African American pilots clearly were legit. And it put Congress, it made so many Americans excited about this pilot program of getting African Americans to be able to fly combat planes that it just made the program so popular that Congress could no longer, even the haters there, shut down the program. And African Americans were sent overseas to fight and were highly decorated. The Red Tails are the most famous group. So she's going to be a hero for supporting both women and African Americans. I think she's one of the best first ladies ever. In conclusion, FDR is going to have a million ideas to support the American people. And those ideas are going to be called the New Deal. It's a poker metaphor. You don't like the cards the government has given you or society has given you? I'll give you new cards. I'll support you in a new way. So 1933, FDR is going to be elected, replace Herbert Hoover, and begin to help the American people. But that is a topic for another time. So that said, FDR, thank you for the New Deal, giving the American people a new set of cards. And again, the New Deal is going to start, and it's going to take a lot of years to get us out of the Great Depression. But the New Deal is certainly going to be parts of what makes America, I was going to say great again, but basically gets us out of that massive depression, that and the spending of World War II. Well, thank you for listening. And our next topic certainly will be to dive into the New Deal, exactly how FDR helped the American people. Thank you.